So we're going to begin with why some countries are rich and why some countries are poor. When we look at the origins of the current income disparities across countries, we turn to Jared Diamond. His approach is unique, and it is not the only approach, but it is an interesting one. His approach says where you are makes the difference, not who you are. Where you are in the world will determine whether you are rich or whether you are poor. So if we look at his overall bottom line, early development of food production or early arrival of food production leads to vast enough production to produce large surpluses. The surpluses lead to large, dense, sedentary, stratified societies. That leads to the accumulation of global power with guns, germs, and steel to dominate other societies as well as accumulate wealth. Note, this is not anything special about the people in these various large regions that makes them rich. It is instead where they lived. So how is this, right? How is this that food production determines, early food production determines massive wealth? Well, we start with food production versus hunting and gathering. Rational economic agents are maximizing their return on calories with the least amount of cost, time, and effort, given some level of certainty, right? If you starve for a week, the game is over. So historically, the various groups have judged each other negatively, right? Hunter and gatherer is seen as less than someone who lives in a solid farming community, that somehow they are less developed. But in fact, all on average are driven by economic rationality. Both groups, the hunters and gatherers as well as the farmers, are driven by economic rationality. Evidence includes the fact that when food production or various crops were introduced, a group would adopt the production suited to their environment. So again, you are rich because you lived in a certain region. And in that region, you adopted early farming techniques. You adopted farming early. You left hunting and gathering, and you joined the farmers earlier. All right, now who did that? Was it just the smarter ones that found themselves farming instead of hunting and gathering? And the answer is no. It turns out each group had different incentives, but those that had the incentives to start farming early were the ones that ended up with the power and the wealth later on. Some of the reasons we have seen this transition globally between hunting and gathering to farm producing overall has to do with a variety of factors. First is a decline in the availability of wild food. Right at the end of the Pleistocene, there was an extinction of all of the large mammals in the Americas, some in Eurasia and Africa. Many blame humans, some blame climate. Either way, we no longer had these large mammals to hunt. We also had an increased availability of domesticable wild plants with climate changes. So climate change also brought wild plants that could be domesticated. That led to more farming. There was also the development of technologies for collecting, processing, and storing wild foods, blades, baskets, roasting. As those became more advanced, farming was more attractive. And then we get this autocalytic process of increased food production leading to increased population. This transition from hunters and gatherers to food production increases birth rates. Therefore, food production becomes more necessary and expands. This increase in food production increases sedentary settlement. Increasing sedentary settlement increases population, so greater food production was required. Interestingly enough, sedentary societies were able to have a shorter time period between children. If you are a hunter or gatherer and you are moving between seasons to different areas, you had to have a 4-year-old before you could have a new baby, because you could only carry one child at a time. However, in a sedentary society, you could have those kids 2 years apart. So you really had this process of increasing population when you had a sedentary lifestyle. Again, that forces you to be more sedentary to increase your food production and more kids and so on. Right? So the food producers turned out to be more numerous and therefore could displace or kill the hunters and gatherers when they wanted their resources. Note, you could adopt farming if your group was large enough or geographically protected. So you could have farmers come at your society, and instead of being dominated or killed by them, you could just adopt their farming techniques. But typically, you would have to be a large enough hunting and gathering group, or you had to be geographically blessed such that those farmers were coming at you at a distance where you were safe. So if you look specifically, when you think early farming means guns, germs, and steel, which means you are going to end up one of the rich societies, we look very specifically at how plants and animals are domesticated. It turns out the earliest Fertile Crescent crops were approximately in 8000 BCE. These are the grains and the pulses, wheat, barley, and peas. These were easy to grow and store and had very little variation from the wild varieties. Then came the fruit and nut trees around 4000 BCE. And it takes 3 years for these trees to bear fruit, so the society must be settled for a long period of time. That's why these came a little bit later. And then we needed, in our next wave, domesticated food, we had fruit trees that required grafting. These were approximately 500 BCE. These were your pears and your apples. And those fruit trees requiring grafting were discovered by the Chinese. In fact, you couldn't just take a seed from an apple, plant it, and get the same variety of apple. You had to actually take a branch off of an apple tree that was the variety that you wanted and graft it to another tree in order to get the variety you were hoping for. So again, the technology was more advanced, and it took until 500 BCE in order to get that technology. And then the last big domesticated crop were the weeds. These were the little plants and shrubs that grew in the orchards, in the fields. These weeds were around the same time period. These are 500 BCE. Beets, oats, rye, and lettuce. So when you look at these farming societies, they were gradually domesticating more and more crops in order to serve their growing population. In addition to growing crops, they used domesticated animals also as a food source. And the requirements for domesticating animals, or the requirements of an animal to be domesticable, are very strict. In fact, you had to have a diet that was herb-based, right? They had to be herbivores or omnivores, plant-based diets. Otherwise, it was just too expensive, right? If you were trying to raise lions for food, you would have to raise a lot of other animals to feed the lions in order to get the calories from the lions. So instead, they focus on herbivores as domesticable animals because those are the ones that require much less food. These animals also have to grow at a really rapid rate, right? You don't want to wait 40 years in order to eat this animal that you are raising, or 20 years to eat this animal that you are raising. They need to grow relatively quickly. Also, problems of captive breeding. These guys can't have mating rituals that require time and space. They have to be able to reproduce in captivity very easily. They have to have a mild temperament. We can't domesticate hippopotamus, right? These are the folks that kill that kill their zookeepers at the zoos. We have to have relatively kind animals, ones that aren't going to attack their owners or kill their breeders. And the animals must not have a tendency to panic. Animals with a tendency to panic tend to kill themselves in captivity, right? They panic, they run, and they get caught up by the gates. So these are a lot of very strict requirements to domesticate animals, including, and finally, the social structure has to be very stratified. Animals have to be used to following the leader if they are going to live in a herd. So when we look at what countries are rich and what countries are poor, what regions are rich, which regions are poor, those folks with animals that were kind, that were large, that were herbivores and omnivores, that were comfortable breeding in captivity. We're narrowing ourselves down to very few animals: sheep, goats, cows, later horses, camels, donkeys. Really, we're left with that list that showed up in its entirety at around 2500 BCE, and we're stuck with it, right? We've added, I think, the llama, maybe one other, but in general, we are stuck with a very short list of animals that you can domesticate. So why then? Why are the countries that we know today rich and the other countries poor? We know they had to be early food adopters because those early food adopters had the larger societies. Those larger societies tended to be much better at dominating in warfare. They also had the technology in warfare to dominate other societies. In addition to using the large animals for food, they also introduced with these large animals germs into their societies. So when folks live with animals in the barn nearby, in the same house with you, you're around them a lot, you get to share diseases with the animals, and you get to build up various immunities to animal diseases. And so when you look at those societies that dominated, that became rich, they were the ones with the guns, the germs, and the steel. They were the early food adopters. The early food adopters, the early domesticated animal adopters. All right, so who were they, right? If we look at the Fertile Crescent, we find that it was extremely unique. Now, this is the area that's now Iraq, Iran, the area in the Middle East that had the largest zone of Mediterranean climate. They had wet winters, long, hot, dry summers. The greatest climatic variation from season to season and year to year. All of this led to variety in plants so that you could domesticate them. Wide range of altitudes and topographies within a short distance, which meant high diversity in plants and animals. Right, 4 of the domesticable animals thrived in this area. There was also less competition from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. There was a short coastline, you couldn't fish well, few rivers, gazelle had been overhunted. Wild grains provided enough for sedentary societies to begin farming, right? To begin that domesticable plant process, like how they were going to. Wild grains provided enough for sedentary societies to begin the process of farming early. We also had something unique about the continent that the Fertile Crescent was on. The Fertile Crescent itself provided this wide variety of plants and animals that were going to lead to early food adoption. We also had the orientation of the continent of Eurasia being east-west. We had early production of food in the Americas, in Mesoamerica, in Africa, in the Sahel. But it was the food production of the Fertile Crescent that spreads farming techniques, technology, domesticable animals across the continent that the Fertile Crescent was on much more rapidly. If you look at the Americas and Africa, you had relatively slow diffusion of these farming techniques, of these domesticated animals, of crops, of livestock knowledge. It was slow to spread as a result of the north-south orientation. If we look Mexico to the U.S. Southwest, the knowledge of farming and seeds moved at less than a half a mile per year. Corn and beans moved from Mexico to the eastern U.S. at 0.3 miles per year. Llamas moved from Peru to Ecuador at 0.2 miles per year. However, crops and animals moved from Southwest Asia to Europe and Egypt at 0.7 miles per year. That might not seem like a big difference, right? You have your 0.3, your 0.5 versus 0.7. However, over decades after decade after decade, this made a really huge difference. If you look at the east-west orientation of Eurasia, they had the same day length, the same seasonal variations, similar diseases, similar regimes of temperature and rainfall and habitats, much more similar than those continents with a north-south orientation, where you have such different climates close to the equator than you have so far from the equator. Not only this food production and livestock, but also technology traveled more easily in Eurasia, giving that continent more guns, germs, and steel. It turns out technology went hand in hand with early food production. Earliest wheels were on carts carrying agricultural produce. Writing was done by the elites, while supported by peasant food production. This explanation, where geography is what makes the difference between a rich country and a poor country, is very interesting, and it does tell part of the story. However, there are difficulties with this approach. It's too simple, right? There is more that goes on, and there are regions of one continent that are richer and poorer, and there are places where we can see early food production didn't necessarily lead to the same level of success. However, what Diamond gives us is some insight into what could be giving us this difference between poor and rich countries that in economic development we're trying to explain, and we're trying to get those poor countries caught up with those rich countries. So it's not ideal, right? Diamond's approach is not ideal. It's too simplistic. It can tell part of the story, but not the whole story. One other school of thought that has been talked about quite a bit with Diamond's approach is the approach by Acemoglu and quite a few others that says that institutions are what matters most. Not just geography, not just whether you were an early food producer and got the guns, germs, and steel, but also the institutions that you develop as a society, the way that humans themselves decide to organize their societies will determine whether or not they prosper. So, wide variety of papers, each one has its own take on this answer to the question of who is rich or why one is rich and why one is poor. However, institutions can lead to innovation, risk-taking, saving for the future, human capital growth or education. The real problem that we have with this approach, however, is that what determines institutions, right? Who determines institutions? Are you successful, so you develop successful institutions, or are you developing the institutions first and therefore become successful? And this chicken and the egg question has been very, very difficult for economists to really pinpoint how exactly institutions are involved in economic growth, right? Do you have good growth strategy, which means you adopt these great institutions, or was it the great institutions that gave you this great growth strategy? So both Diamond and Acemoglu give us interesting pieces to the puzzle of why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. But neither explanation is the total picture, right? It just gives us a hint of why we find ourselves with the goal of economic development.